after Kim's discussion on the Dutch experience and the way Wolfgang introduced it into how that could be seen linking open science and rewarding recognition. Let's now take a look at another platform, OSCOM as a European initiative and NORCAM as a particular elaboration of that idea in Norway, and talk about narrative CVs. So first about OSCOM. OSCOM is the topic of a report that was launched in Toulouse in 2017 in a European Commission organized conference, and exactly it contains the Open Science Career Assessment Matrix. What it aimed at was to link open science development to research career assessment practices. So in that sense, it formed an inspiration for many things to follow. It was an inspiration for the Dutch development, which is, as Kim explained, clear, trying to link top-down and bottom-up approaches together. But it also formed a clear inspiration for the Norwegian NORCAM framework. So NORCAM is actually developed in Norway by the Universities Norway, as said, inspired by European and Dutch developments. And the idea is to create a more flexible and holistic framework for recognition and reward in academic performance assessment. So flexible in a way that you can adjust to, for example, development with respect to career trajectories, and holistic in a way that it means to include a wider set of activities that academics are performing on a day-by-day basis. So the intended users for NORCAM are academic institutions when it comes to recruitment, promotion, and career guidance for funders in order to assess both the reviewers as well as the proposals sent in by academics or researchers in more general, and the national government to assist in the assessment of education and research. So NORCAM aims at three core principles of assessment: transparency, so it strives for making agreements on what actually counts as valuable contributions in the different tasks that academics are involved in, teaching, research, leadership, outreach, etc. Covering more activities, so not only aim at research as an academic activity, but also aim at other activities, like Kim explained as well. That's where there's a similarity between NORCAM and the Dutch experiment, and comprehensiveness in terms of information use. And thereby, the idea is to move beyond using research metrics as a form of to base your assessments on, but to be more comprehensive in what counts actually and what can be used to show your activities and your results. So let's now listen to our second open champion of this seminar. It's Alexander Jensenius. He's a professor at the University of Oslo. He's one of the co-creators of the NORCAM framework, and let's listen to Alexander to explain this in detail.
The Norwegian Career Assessment Matrix, NORCAM, is a toolbox for recognition and rewards in academic careers. It was developed by Universities Norway in 2021, and I was a member of the working group. In this short video, I will present the toolbox and its motivation. NORCAM is inspired by the work in other European countries, particularly Finland and the Netherlands. It also builds on various reports and initiatives by the European Commission, Science Europe, and the European University Association. As a member of EUA's Open Science Expert Group, I have followed this work closely over several years, and I'm pleased to see the enormous political and cultural shift that is currently happening. The matrix consists of 6 areas of competencies to be assessed: research output, research process, pedagogical competence, impact and innovation, leadership, and other experience. We acknowledge that institutions are different and that the detailing of the results and competencies for each of these areas need to be worked out in close collaboration with the respective research fields. Still, These overarching areas cover what we believe are core competencies required in research and higher education. Each competency needs to be documented in some way or another. This could include lists of publications or artistic works, links to databases or datasets, courses taught and students supervised. Some of these already have established systems and metrics. For others, it's necessary to develop new documentation strategies, including quality control of the documentary evidence. Each competency should also be accompanied by a subjective reflection on its quality and relevance. Endless lists of publications or courses taught may not be particularly helpful for an assessment committee. Then it may be more relevant to read the candidate's reflection on why these matter. However, the reflection must be backed up by documentary evidence. A committee needs to be able to check that the person's claims are valid. The matrix provides a framework for systematically describing, documenting and reflecting on one's competencies. However, to be helpful, it requires tools for efficiently creating and assessing such matrices. That is why we also propose to create an Automagic CV system. The idea here is that this could build on or even be integrated into existing quiz systems. It should be web-based, user-friendly, and allow for easy import and export of relevant information. Much of this information is already available from various data sources, so we don't need to reinvent the wheel. Rather, it's a matter of integration and quality control. We believe that such a matrix system, including the necessary tools to make it a reality, will help to measure quality and excellence through a better balance between quantitative and qualitative goals, recognize several competencies as merits, but not in all areas at the same time or by each employee, assess all results, activities and competencies in the light of open science principles, practice transparency and assessment and visibility of what should be recognized as merit, promote gender balance and diversity, and assist in the concrete practice of job vacancy announcements and assessment processes locally. At the moment, Norwegian higher education institutions, including my own here at the University of Oslo, are working on how to implement NORCAM locally. The toolbox has generally received positive feedback here in Norway, and I see that there is a lot of international interest. NORCAM is a toolbox that can help us move from policymaking to concrete action.
I hope you see the similarities and also the differences between the two approaches in both the Netherlands and in Norway. As Alexander explained, there are 6 basic principles of NORCAM, and let's take a somewhat closer look to these basic principles. The first thing he mentioned was to balance information and assessing quality and excellence. And the NORCAM report says that you should take care in bibliometric material should not be given a dominant position in the way you assess research, but balance it with more qualitative information to supplement the metrics. I would, however, like to challenge your thinking with, would it be better to just start with qualitative information and add metrics to that? That is what we call in the field of science studies and evaluation studies informed peer review, whereby the qualitative perspectives from the peers are actually the dominant way to assess research. So the second principle is recognize a variety of competencies and avoid one-dimensionality. So that's actually talking about a variety of metrics, but do not expect all individuals to excel in that. And this is starting from the idea that assessment of research of an individual should be seen in the light of the context of the team, the bigger collective. So in that sense, any staff member in a team should not be seen as a sheep with 5 legs, but everybody can excel in his own merits. And as a team member, you complement your colleagues in the team, and together you can stimulate and grow to, larger results and more success. Apply open science principles in assessing academic work. In NORCAM, this principle means that openness should be seen as an integrated part of academic work. In the light of the work by the Research Council Norway and NWO, that means applying transparent policies on what is expected from researchers that apply for grants in your both organizations, and against which criteria proposals are being assessed. So to translate this particular philosophy from NORCAM to your own practices, this could be a very helpful way forward. The fourth principle is apply transparency in what is recognized as merits. This means actually that you are clear about what counts and what is valued as outcomes from the different perspective of the different kind of activities that team members are supposed to do. So be clear about what counts as merits and as values in teaching or in research or in impact, so that people know what they're being held accountable for in the assessment of academic work in a more holistic perspective. Support and promote gender balance and diversity. This is something that is taking a central position in many of these reforms. Changes in the assessment criteria must be sensitive to impact on gender balance and diversity. But here, of course, we have to be aware of that this is not taken up as only a formal approach whereby informally nothing will change, because it's really difficult to make this particular principle work. So by replacing scholarly publishing as one major criteria with a broader perspective, you create more equal and fair chances for women, men, and also people with a minority background. And the final principle is assist in the concrete practice of job vacancy announcement and assessment process locally. This actually relates to how NORCAM can be helpful in different stages of a career with recruitment and appraisal talks, and so promotion, but also whenever people want to shift paths within a career trajectory, NORCAM should be seen as a tool to facilitate such changes in a career of any individual in the light of the team. Let's now shift our attention to a more recent initiative, that's COADA, which stands for the Coalition for Advancing Research Assessment. This is a recent development this year it happened. There are currently 350 institutions of over 40 countries are signing up to COADA, and the idea is to create a shared direction for changes in the practice of research assessment. So the goal is to maximize quality and impact of research, whereby openness is definitely one of those quality markers. And the report that COADA has issued includes principles, commitments, and timeframes to reform and implementing the changes needed across all the signing institutions. As said, a large number of organizations have already signed up to the agreement. So COADA issues actually 10 commitments, and let's see how you can see that in the light of what we've been talking about so far. The first commitment is a recognition of diversity in the light of needs and the nature of research. So this means that people should not have all same skills, but be aware of that research is a team effort whereby people contribute on their own merits to the process of conducting research. With respect to research assessment techniques, apply responsible techniques, balance quantitative information with qualitative information, abandon journal impact factors, rankings, and the H-index. Use assessment resources wisely, so what is needed to change the organization and what resources are needed to support these kind of changes in that. Scrutinize research assessment tools and procedures frequently, and communicate on the changes made and the reforms made. Exchange practices and experience to enable mutual learning. So learning is important. That's why this commitments 6 and 7 are important, to communicate about your changes made, but also to communicate progress made and evaluate your criteria, practice, and tools based on solid evidence. And that relates, for example, what Alexander was talking about the documentation. You have to be clear about what is actually supporting the claims you make with respect to the changes you are aiming for and realizing. From here, I will give the floor back to Wolfgang.
Yes, so now we move on to another recent development in research assessment that is relevant to open science, and that is the adoption of narrative CV formats by funding bodies throughout Europe. So there's an entire wave of narrative CV initiatives going on, for example, by NVO, which is actually calls it the evidence-based CV. There are also initiatives going on in Switzerland, in Luxembourg, in Germany. There are also initiatives of this sort, also in the UK, and it's actually being done both by funding bodies as well as universities. And then in the case of universities, it's of course more in a kind of a hiring and promotion context. And there's also even a next step already being taken by UKRI. That's kind of this umbrella organization of British funders, which aims to harmonize actually the narrative CV formats being used by these different organizations, because too many different formats is of course itself kind of an issue. But in any case, the basic idea behind narrative CVs is to replace or complement the focus that traditional CV formats place on, publication lists, on metrics, on funding history, with narrative elements where researchers can essentially tell little contextual stories about themselves, about their work, where they can describe their scientific achievements in sort of more qualitative, more narrative terms, which is meant to broaden our view basically of what counts as a scientific achievement, to diversify the activities that are considered relevant, and to also prevent that peer review decision making in a peer review context for funding, for example, is reduced essentially to a quantitative comparison. So to prevent basically reviewers from immediately jumping to these metric shortcuts when they have to prioritize funding proposals under time constraints. So the idea is to essentially, in short, promote responsible evaluation sensibilities in peer review and funding. Excuse me, I should have pressed this before. And there's also, of course, a particular opportunity here to promote open science, in the sense that you can also use narrative CV formats to encourage researchers to showcase really their open science activities. So to talk about work that they have done to make data available, to engage with society, to do perhaps open peer review, these kinds of things. So all of the things that are usually that fall sort of through the cracks in the traditional CV formats. So there's a special connection here in this sense to open science. At the same time, narrative CVs are of course, a bit of a controversial issue as well. So they raise, they raise the question, if reviewers should not look primarily at these traditional kind of comparative information like publication lists, like metrics. What is it that they should focus on? And there is discussion going on, I think, in almost all countries where narrative CVs are being introduced. In the Netherlands in particular, there was a letter published by a group of Dutch professors who expressed concern about lack of objectivity that comes with narrative CVs. So they were quite critical of this idea of narrative CVs. They also criticized, in fact, recognition and rewards more broadly for sort of making evaluative criteria more diffuse. But there was also then a response to this letter by a group of younger researchers. So it was interesting to see that the criticism came primarily from the professors, but in response to this letter, there was another letter that actually was much more favorable of narrative CV formats and of recognition and rewards. So that's an interesting dynamic. I want to contribute a bit more to this particular discussion and to this challenge or opportunity raised by narrative CV formats by presenting insights from an empirical study that we did at the CVTS on the introduction of a narrative CV format by a large European funding body in 2020. And I'll keep the details and the name of the organization confidential. I hope this is okay with you. But in any case, the format that was used for this particular funding program, so the narrative CV format that was used, featured four basically text fields where applicants could describe their main scientific achievements in, I think, 200 words. There were a couple of other novelties sort of related to the innovation in the format. So there was a limited publication list, for example. People could only mention a limited number of publications in the context of these narratives. There was also a limit on the number of grants that could be mentioned, for example. So a couple of novelties in the format. And we were basically asked to follow and kind of assess this initiative and kind of talk about how successful it has been and what could be done to sort of help it make it more sort of practical and sort of deal with all sorts of problems that would perhaps be raised in the process of introducing it. And in this context, we collected all sorts of data. We did, for example, participant observation in the review panel meetings. We also did interviews with applicants and reviewers, and also surveys with all the user groups. And the first interesting finding in the participant observation was, and that's perhaps unsurprising, that many reviewers regularly fell back on traditional information available online. So what they did was, or many of them at least, is they went immediately online, basically, to retrieve full publication lists, traditional metrics, and all of the other information that was intentionally omitted from this new CV format, which was, of course, a disappointment for the organizers of the initiative, because the idea was really to only rely on this information that was provided in this official narrative CV. But in practice, the narrative elements were used, but they were often used really to supplement more traditional types of information. And in many cases, the evaluative practice that we observed was in this sense relatively traditional. But we did find some quite interesting things when combining this participant observation with interviews and surveys, in particular with the reviewers. So we firstly found that younger reviewers expressed systematically more positive opinions about the narrative elements compared to the more senior reviewers. So they found the narrative elements useful to show, all sorts of connections between projects that are otherwise not visible. They occasionally also pointed out open science practices that could be portrayed in the narrative elements. And they found the narratives particularly useful for cases where the reviewers were not from the same fields as the applicants, and where they could not, intuitively make sense of particular bits of information, like a publication. How important is a particular journal in the field? Stuff like that. So things that you intuitively place into context is something that you cannot do when you look at CVs from other fields. So in short, the younger reviewers were really overall quite positive about the narrative elements, contrary to the senior reviewers. And by the way, the visualizations on the bottom of the slide are simply visualizations of the survey results. We will also, by the way, publish a paper on the basis of these findings as part of the course bibliography, so you will be able to look into that in more detail if you're interested. But yeah, so this is a first very interesting finding, that there was a significant difference in terms of seniority that affected how critical people were of the narrative elements. In our interpretation, the different perceptions, of course, point to the fact that peer review is itself a practice that is learned over time. So older reviewers tend to be specialized in traditional career expectations, whereas younger reviewers have shorter careers and also less rigid expectations when it comes to evaluative criteria. And that's good on one hand, because it implies that review practices are malleable in principle, so they can change, and they can also change in such a way as to emphasize and give more room to open science practices, but it takes time. And any kind of first attempt will require greater effort on the part of reviewers, either to learn or to relearn, especially in the case of older reviewers, how to do peer review with a different format. So it's not simply that you can change information that you provide in a CV and you immediately get a different kind of assessment. It's rather a different kind of practice that you have to cultivate over time. And there will always be, of course, an inevitable trade-off between qualitative narrative elements and easy comparability. Second, very interesting finding was that the status of reviewers really made a difference. So the review panel was actually constituted to 60% by scientific members of the funding body. So that's how this particular funding body works in this particular country. It has elected scientific members, very sort of accomplished elite scientists who are elected into the funding body, which is a bit like being elected into the Royal Academy. So it's very prestigious. And then the remaining roughly 40% of the reviewers were visiting panelists, partly also from abroad, who were only invited for this particular occasion. And there is again a statistically clearly significant trend here, according to which the scientific members of the funding body were much more critical of the narrative elements compared to the external reviewers. And that has to do with, well, power conflict essentially within the organization. So the scientific members of the funding body simply didn't like being told how to do peer review by their administrative colleagues. So they felt that, you know, the funding body is overstepping its boundaries by forcing them to use a narrative CV. So this particular intervention has, in this sense, interfered with power structures, you could say, in this organization, or it has brought to the fore already kind of brewing discontent in this relation between administrative staff and scientific staff, which is interesting, of course. So it's something that you need to disentangle. Few short conclusions from this. So changing CV practices and using novel CV formats to promote open science, it seems, will involve rethinking the entire design of review processes. So it's not just about changing access to information, which information you provide, but you should also, as an organization, think about, for example, composition of panels. Who is on the panels? What's the kind of balance between, you know, senior and junior reviewers? You should also think about how much time is made available for reviewing a particular number of proposals, so that reviewers can, you know, actually invest the time necessary to make use of novel features without, again, having to resort to all sorts of metric shortcuts. And this is what I meant with my last with the point that I just made, that it's important to make explicit the different kinds of politics that are involved in this, apparently. So a legitimate disagreement about what constitutes useful CV formats should be distinguished from power conflicts within organization, to avoid that these become sort of mixed up with each other. All right. Kind of an open question at this point is what happens when learning effects kick in. So when applicants and reviewers become sort of used to using narrative CV formats. Will it, for example, mean that applicants will essentially become very good at sort of self-promotion? Will they get very good at sort of, you know, showcasing all sorts of hyperbolic achievements? Will this become essentially a new exercise in window dressing? So that's a possibility, of course. We don't know. It could be that the informational value is reduced when people, you know, begin to use narrative CVs in this way, and then maybe in a few years' time, this has become the kind of new convention and has developed all sorts of other problems, but we don't know. So I think it's open at this point, and at the current moment, I think it's really interesting because, well, exactly, we don't know where we are going, and when scientists use the narrative format, they really have to think about what they want to put in there. So it's kind of a moment where fundamental questions in a way about what is valuable in research are being raised.